Hello, friends. I'm so glad you're here. You know, sometimes, after a long day, it's nice to slow down and settle into a cozy spot where we can share stories together. This is a special place where bedtime stories help us unwind, spark our imaginations, and gently guide us into sweet dreams. Each night, we'll go on an adventure. Some will be fun, some a little mysterious, but all of them will be told with care, just for you. So grab your favorite blanket, get nice and comfy, and let's enjoy the story together. It's a wonderful way to end the day, isn't it? I'm so happy you're here with me. Tonight's story is called Drift. The endless stretch of outer space was a quiet companion for Etta. She sat in the pilot's chair of the Lone Star, staring out through the thick, reinforced glass that seemed to absorb the starlight around her. It was dark here, darker than any night she'd ever seen on Earth. And as her eyes traced the faint glimmers of distant stars, she felt like she was floating in a dream, barely anchored to reality. Her journey was solitary, an assignment she had taken on willingly, or perhaps out of a quiet desperation for silence. Months of communication delays, hours of unbroken darkness, and the steady hum of the Lone Star's engine had become her only constants. This particular route was one rarely traveled, known to be treacherous and vast. The ship was headed to Nebula 712, a cluster few dared to explore, its secrets hidden by the sheer distance that deterred even the most ambitious explorers. Her face was lit only by the dim, cold glow of the control panel. Numbers blinked and shifted in rhythmic patterns that only she could read. Signals of life on the other side of the metal shell, protecting her from the void. But that life was limited to the ship's mechanical heartbeat and the gentle reminder of systems checks. She had started talking to it, addressing it as Star when she spoke aloud. Anything to break the eerie stillness. Star, she said, her voice cracking the silence. What do you think of all this? A low hum responded. Some vibration within the ship that she'd grown accustomed to interpreting as agreement or dissent. She imagined Star's responses, making them up as she went along, creating a companion out of necessity. The ship was fully automated, but Etta's hand still hovered over the controls. She liked to feel in control, to remind herself that she was at the helm, even if it often felt like the universe itself was dictating her course. Floating aimlessly through space had a way of blurring boundaries between her, the ship, and the void outside. It was supposed to be a simple survey mission, an 8-month trip out and back. But when the final check-in beacon had gone offline a month into her journey, she'd been left with no way to confirm her progress. The distance was simply too great. She knew Star's systems would allow her to return, but without confirmation from home, she was a phantom drifting in the unknown. The isolation was more profound than she had anticipated. Etta began to see things that weren't there, flickers in the periphery of her vision, shadowy figures dancing along the edges of the control panel. She'd laughed them off at first, a slight smile tugging at her lips, as she dismissed them as tricks of the mind. But the longer she traveled, the harder it became to brush them away. They grew, those figures, and took on more solid forms. Sometimes, in a fit of exhaustion, she'd reach out toward them, only to grasp the cold air. Each day she went through the motions, preparing meals, running diagnostics, and checking the navigation logs, as though the rituals could stave off the ever-encroaching darkness. Her calendar told her that it was late in the year back on Earth. She imagined snow blanketing her hometown, the quiet streets lined with holiday lights, a place she'd left behind to chase something she could no longer define. Somewhere along the way, she began to lose track of time. Hours slipped into days without warning, and she found herself drifting further from the person she'd been when she first boarded the Lone Star. She spoke aloud less often, letting silence settle around her like a second skin. The stars outside were cold and indifferent, witnesses to her slow unraveling. There was a point in the journey when Etta finally stopped counting the days. The logs showed signs of her descent into routine. One day, she had written, and then, some indeterminate time later, simply another day. Each entry grew sparser, as though words themselves were fading from her. One evening, or at least what her internal clock suggested was evening, she stood by the observation deck, staring at the thin ring of light surrounding Nebula 712. She could see the edges of the gas clouds now, swirling colors of deep purples and blues, hues that felt rich enough to touch. She was close, but as she approached the edge of the nebula, an uneasy sensation settled over her. A slow creeping chill that wrapped around her chest. The ship's hum seemed to change, a low rumble that felt almost like a warning. She glanced at the navigation screen, expecting to see an alert, but there was nothing. Only the silent, vast beauty of the nebula ahead, beckoning her deeper into its embrace. For the first time, she hesitated. "Star," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this safe?" There was no response, only the steady thrum of machinery. But she knew there was no turning back now. The nebulous fog swallowed the Lone Star, and her view of the stars outside dimmed, replaced by a thick, swirling mist that seemed to press in on all sides. Hours passed as she drifted further into the nebula. The light outside took on strange qualities, bending and warping, as though the nebula itself was alive, breathing with each gentle pulse. Colors shifted, bleeding into each other in unnatural ways, as though the universe had rewritten its own rules. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the comforting sense of someone looking out for her. It was the sensation of eyes, cold, unblinking, assessing her from every corner of the ship. Shadows crept along the walls, growing longer, darker, until they seemed to press against her. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms into the armrests, grounding herself against the rising tide of panic. "Star," she whispered again, almost pleading, "what is this?" The shadows flickered, shifted, and then resolved into a single figure standing at the edge of her vision. She forced herself to look, expecting to find nothing, but the figure remained. A vague human shape cloaked in darkness, a silent watcher. Etta tried to focus, but her vision blurred. She felt something inside her stir, a memory, or was it a feeling, of something old, something buried deep. The figure stood motionless, observing her. She knew it wasn't real, Yet the heaviness in her chest told her otherwise. Was this the nebula playing tricks? Or something else entirely? A strange calm settled over her. She no longer feared the isolation. She feared what waited for her here in the heart of the nebula. Time lost its meaning, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind weaving images from the depths of her memory. Faces she thought she'd forgotten, voices she hadn't heard in years, and emotions she'd buried long ago. In a rare moment of clarity, she activated the ship's logs, forcing herself to speak. "This is Etta," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know where I am. I don't know if this is still the same nebula I entered, or if I've drifted somewhere else. There's something here. I don't know if I'm seeing things, or if it's real, but it's watching me." Her voice broke. "I don't know if I'll make it back. I don't know if I even want to." The silence that followed was profound, pressing down on her like a weight. She stared at the navigation logs, knowing they held the same message they had for weeks. No updates, no messages from home. She was utterly, devastatingly alone. She drifted toward the observation deck once more, drawn to the nebula's hypnotic colors. The shadows crept around her again, but this time she welcomed them. She felt a strange acceptance settle over her. Out here, in the vast emptiness, she was not the explorer she had once imagined herself to be. She was something smaller, something vulnerable and fleeting. The universe was indifferent to her, a solitary traveler, and she found a strange peace in that realization. As the lone star floated deeper into the nebula, Etta closed her eyes, letting the darkness seep into her. She was no longer afraid of the shadows. They had become her companions, her only source of connection in the cold emptiness of space. Time slipped away, and eventually, so did she. Her last thought before she surrendered to the void was of home, the memory of a distant place, a flicker of warmth in an otherwise endless night. She would not return, but somehow it felt as though she'd come full circle. The nebula held her close, a final resting place among the stars, her solitary journey fading into the infinite unknown. And as the lone star drifted, silent and unobserved, the universe continued on, vast and timeless, bearing witness to the story of a lone traveler who had dared to touch the shadows of the stars. The end. Well, wasn't that a lovely story? I'm so glad we could share it together. Now, as the day comes to an end, it's time to rest and let all those wonderful thoughts and dreams carry you through the night. Remember, tomorrow is a new day, full of new adventures. And I'll be right here when you're ready for another story. Until then, take a deep breath, get cozy, and know that you are safe, you are loved, and you are important, just the way you are. Good night, and sleep well.